Hello, and welcome to Professor M Explains. Today, we're going to talk about communication challenges in adulthood. First, we're going to cover the marital and partnership communication process. Here I have material, but it's marital. And the next, we're going to discuss family communication. Again, as promised, this is a summary. And for all intents and purposes, I hope that you have read the chapter, reviewed it, and also can recollect and recall what we've talked about in class that would apply to this chapter and this area of discussion. So let's begin with a summary with regards to marital partnership and communication. In communication, there is the notion that gender has a role and has a part in the level and the categories of communication. The discussion of gender differences in communication is important because scholars believe that understanding and appreciating such differences is a fundamental challenge for people in most marriages and romantic partnerships. With respect to nonverbal communication, research indicates differences in the use of personal space, gaze, touch, facial expression, voice, and gesture. Differences in the use of language include contrast between masculine and feminine styles of speech, as well as key differences in particular features of language. Scholars also feel that gender socialization and sex role stereotyping, more than biological sex, seem to be responsible for most male and female patterns of communication, as well as miscommunication. There are different types of marriages based on how the partners see their role in the union, how connected they are with one another, and how they deal with conflict issues in their marriage. Research on marital maintenance and marital conflict sheds light on how couples can use communication in everyday situations and in disagreements to avoid destructive behaviors that are likely to break them apart. Research also shows that couples in alternate forms of romantic partnerships that are categorized in the LP Let me repeat. Research shows that couples in alternate forms of romantic partners, as in our text has mentioned gays and lesbian partnerships, but for the purpose of this lecture, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual relationships and partnerships face the same communication challenges as those faced by couples in traditionally categorized heterosexual relationships. Also, domestic violence, while it's a serious problem in many romantic partnerships, no relationship category or gender label separates domestic violence from the discussion of communication. Now, when we're summarizing family communication, here we are talking about families and family communication and how it's presented, a definition of family and the variety of family forms that we experience, ranging from nuclear families to binuclear families to extended and step parenting family forms. Families can also be studied using the systems theory approach, which explores interaction from the perspective of the whole family interacting as a unit instead of from the perspective of the individual. Power in families is also relevant in that it is relational construct. It is a relational construct and is constantly negotiated in terms of the power resources that are available and valued in the family. What works as powerful today may not be powerful 10 years from now in the family system, particularly since we are looking at the generational changes with multi-generational children coming up. They're raising into their own interest and with their own modality of the way they view life and the way they want and choose to live their lives. As we talked about in other chapters, we talked about the individualistic approach that the United States is taking and how many of our youth are tuned in to self-care, tuned into their individual needs. And so this innately will impact the family dynamic and how the family system shifts in generations to come. The family unit develops through life stages based on the developmental stages of children in the family, as well as the current configurations of the family system. There is also current research on sibling relationships and parent-child relationships in and within the varied family forms. Now, when we think about and we discuss the areas with regards to marital and partnership communication, it's an interesting quote here I have on the slide. It is not a lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes marriages or makes unhappy marriages. So keep that in mind, that the core center of any successful marriage is the core center of interpersonal communication and that connection to the purpose of building a relationship from intimacy to commitment. Here, we're focused on gender differences in communication, nonverbal communication and language, marital success and communication, marital types and maintenance. As I mentioned before, gay and lesbian couples, but for the intensive purposes of this lecture, we are including lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, as well as asexual. The entire community here. Domestic violence and romantic partnerships, as well as romantic partnerships, marriage, and social media. So when we look at the gender differences in communication, we understand that historically, people have tended, and scholars and researchers alike have separated and made a distinction between masculine and feminine traits and tendencies. We also discuss androgynous traits. So androgynous traits are customarily considered as a combination of masculine and feminine behavior, depending on the situation that people will display or they will act within that source. Feminine traits assume traditionally feminine sex role stereotypes, such as being nurturing and emotional, while masculine traits assume traditionally masculine sex role types, such as being strong and aggressive. Now, again, for purposes of this lecture, we are talking about the book, and then we are going to interject notions of where we see the trajectory of societal notions and acceptance moving towards in that direction. And that part of the lecture will be supplemented by me. It's not in the textbook. So let's continue to talk about this from an aerial view and a historical perspective, and then we will talk about it in a modern day present tense perspective. Now, when we talk about gender and nonverbal communication, there are things such as personal space, gaze, and touch, where there's gender differences, typically where feminine traits or people who display feminine traits usually are closer in touch, closer in communication. They are very much orientated in terms of body positioning, closer distances, more eye contact, more touch as compared to people who display male traits. People who display male gender traits are typically reflected as being assertive, competitive, cold, and task-oriented. Now, remember, androgynous traits, people who really portray a balance of the two. They have feminine traits, but when necessary, they exhibit some of those traits that have been historically characterized as male traits. Facial expressions is also understood to be gender classified, and that is an example of the nonverbal communication that flows from a gender perspective. Let me give you an example of what this may look like. If you have someone who is displaying feminine traits, then they may roll their eyes while they're talking and kind of tilt their head to the side. When we are conversing with people who are displaying masculine traits, they typically will not roll their eyes and turn their head to the side with a flare or a roll, shall we say. It's interesting to deliver this lecture audio based without the visual of me providing you with the visual, but you can just imagine like your great grandma, or your grandma being upset because the dog tracked mud in the house in the middle of the kitchen, and she's talking about how she told the grandkids not to leave the door open, and she's like rolling her eyes and shaking her head. Okay, but Papa would not roll his eyes and shake his head. Perhaps Papa may say, "Get in here, boy," or "Get in here, little girl, and get this dirt off the floor right now," without rolling his eyes, without shimmering his head, without putting his hand on his hips. But perhaps he may point his finger at the floor and with direct eye-to-eye contact tell little boy, little girl to come in and get the mud off the floor because they left the door open and the dog tracked dirt in the kitchen. Far out example. I hope you could close your eyes and visualize, great grandma or Papa Bear doing those things. All right. So when we come back and we talk about voice and gesture, scholars and researchers alike also make the distinction between genders and how voice and gesture are carried out in the communication process. Again, there's a notion that there is a sense of feminine speech. When we think of feminine speech, researchers have suggested that in the investigation of sex differences, there's a difference in the use of language. Feminine speech perhaps establishes equality between the people. Perhaps feminine speech shows support of others. It attends to the emotional and relational meaning of communication. Feminine speech engages in conversational maintenance work. This is an example of did anything else interesting happen on your trip, as an example, or what do you mean by that, or how was your day? Interestingly enough, as a parent, I typically say, tell me the best part about your day. And then I do that 3 times a day because I want my kids to enjoy and gratitude 3 times. But that's my feminine trait coming out, where I want you to enjoy your day 3 times and find the positive in your day. So when we talk about conversational maintenance work, that's an example of conversational maintenance work. Feminine speech is personal and concrete. Okay. It is also classified as being tentative. Being tentative means using language that expresses uncertainty, a lack of confidence, or perhaps merely openness to other points of view. Interestingly enough, this example would be like when I'm talking to someone or someone's talking to you, they may use a qualifier like that hedges around the conversation. Our text gives an example of, for instance, I could be wrong about this, but or that was a nice dinner, wasn't it? These are examples of feminine dialect or conversational exchange, but it also, interestingly enough, has been associated with individuals who lack self-esteem, who have a low social status, or has also been categorized as being a powerless form of speaking or speech. Now, in contrast to the feminine style, there's masculine speech. And here, the notion is that the person tend to regard talk as a way to exert control, preserve independence, entertain, and enhance status. Here are some examples of masculine speech. Masculine speech seeks to establish status and control. It pursues instrumental objects. It aims for conversational command. It's direct and assertive. It's abstract. It's less emotionally responsive. So again, scholars and researchers alike have made a distinction between the conversational patterns of people who exhibit feminine traits as well as people who exhibit and communicate using masculine traits. When we think of marital success and communication, there are different types of marriages, according to scholars and researchers alike. So, of the different types of marriages, there are some factors that separate marital relationships in multiple categories. So first, there are the traditionals. The traditionals hold conventional ideologies about values, marriage, the husband being the breadwinner, the wife raising the kids, et cetera, et cetera. Traditional couples exhibit a high degree of interdependence. This prompts them to spend a lot of time together sharing activities and sharing information. In addition, they do not in addition, they do not avoid conflict. Now, when we look at independence, they hold unconventional ideological values about marriage. For instance, they believe in individual freedom and novelty. These couples exhibit a strong emotional connection and have a high level of companionship and sharing, marked by psychological closeness, but not necessarily physical proximity. Instead, independent couples embrace the autonomy of action and physical space and do not engage in the timed routines that characterize traditional couples. Now, then, there is the marital type of being labeled as a separate. Separates profess traditional values but place greater emphasis on autonomy. These couples have significantly less companionship and sharing than do traditional or independent couples, but separates also maintain a higher degree of psychological and physical distance, thereby keeping activities separate and interaction at a lower level. Separates tend to avoid conflict. Remember, traditionals do not avoid conflict, but separates avoid conflict. Mixed couples include partners who do not share the same views of marriage. This is I think this is a catch-all to be quite transparent here. When you think about a mixed couple, they just don't share the same views on marriage, which is going to give you conflict. You may have one couple who is traditionally rooted, and then you may have another couple, another part of that couple or that union who would call themselves an independent or a separatist. They do not need to have their partner or their spouse with them everywhere they go. They do not feel it necessary to tell their partner or spouse everywhere they are. They just want to exist and then come home and be together. So again, mixed couples kind of think of that as like a catch-all category. Now, when we talk about marital maintenance, that is interesting because there are relation maintenance strategies that couples should consciously and deliberately use to keep their relationships from eroding in the face of the daily pressures of life. This is intended to make sure that routine behavior, routine circumstances, routine problems do not erode away and chip away at the marriage. And so make sure that you understand that marriage is just it's a relationship. Just as a friendship, marriage is a legal commitment that requires maintenance. So when we talk about marital conflict, we're also talking about the same theories and the same notions and strategies of conflict competence and emotional intelligence and emotional competence. So keep that in mind when you're reviewing this information. There are some findings that marital conflict researchers have developed and some theories. One is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, where there are 4 types of behaviors when you're thinking about conflict in a marriage: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, negative reciprocity. Again, we are looking at different challenges that we see in relationships. It's the same theories, the same flavor of rhetorical concepts that we see in the breakdown and the withdrawal of practical relationships that aren't tied legally via marriage or a close partnered relationship. Again, gay and lesbian couples, for the purposes of our textbook, for the purposes of this lecture, we're talking about LGBTQIA communities. They still have the same problems: communication. The one aspect is to be able to recognize and know problems when they're coming, and understand that while scholars and researchers have made this distinct difference in gender ideologies as it is applied to communication, I think over the next 2 decades, we're going to see this chapter change. We're going to see this chapter evolve, where powers are even. We're seeing more people exhibit more androgynous traits because of the evolution of our gender class and our intergenerational cultures. Do also know that communication can turn violent. And when we think about domestic violence and romantic partnerships, again, we talk about James and Rebecca in previous chapters in the example where Rebecca came after James with a carving knife. Again, when there's signs that the communication process, the marriage is breaking down, do seek help. Seek help from outside sources to provide yourself with a safe haven and a safety area so that you can communicate your concerns with someone who can help and provide support for you. When we talk about romantic partnerships, marriage, and social media, it's interesting because now we have a new notion and a new bountiful like bin of problems. When we introduce the internet and communication into the area of marriage and marital partnerships. So we're talking about cyber sex addiction, online pornography, cyber infidelity, online jealousy, and cyber stalking, to name a few. While this is marital and partnership communication, I do want to take this time to put into the lecture that catfishing is also a problem that is built in, or we're seeing it in romantic partnerships, marriages, and social media, where catfishing is where a person pretends to be someone that they're not or something that they're not. And in the most recent case, without dating this lecture, there was a man who pretended to be someone else and he catfished a teenager. Not only did he drive across the country to pick her up, but in doing so, he unfortunately killed some of her family members and drove away with her. She was rescued, but again, we're talking about social media and technology and how it's unfortunately playing and having an impact on communication and partnerships and partnering. Now we are traveling over to chapter 14, where we are talking about in chapter 14 the combination and notion of family characteristics and types of families. And here with family characteristics and types of families, when we move over to chapter 14, we are now discussing family characteristics and types of families, family systems, the perspective on family systems, as well as, I'm going to get this L out of here. Okay, I didn't fix the other slide. I'll fix the other slide later, but I had to get that L out of there. And family, there we go, friends, and family subsystems. So hang in there with me. We're at the final stretch. When we talk about family characteristics, there's structural family, extended families, Families are dysfunctional, and a lot of times it's because of breakdown and lack of communication and interpersonal communication. Mainly, we've talked about the dynamics of family, and I've even shared some fun stories about mine that I find hilariously entertaining. But when we talk about communication types of amongst family, there's a consensual family where family members are highly interactive. They value conformity and they support the ideal of preserving the family hierarchy. Then there are pluralistic families that have similar communication patterns to the consensual families in terms of open dialogue. However, parents in a pluralistic family do not feel the same need to be in charge of decision making as consensual parents do. Then we have the protective family, where some family patterns and communication are lower on conversation, interaction, and open and exchange, but highly conformative and maintaining a family hierarchy. Protective families are families that where children have decisions made for them and rarely receive explanations. Instead, they emphasize obedience surrounding the support system of this family within the family and parental authority. Children in protected families have fewer opportunities to try decision making on their own, and they tend to lack the confidence and decision making skills. Then there is the family type that is a laissez-faire family. This family type has low conversation and interaction levels within the family, similar to the protective family type, but it does not have the emphasis on maintaining family structure or rules. The laissez-faire families believe all family members should be able to make their own decisions, but these parents have limited interaction with their children about the kinds of decisions that they must make, as well as the outcomes of those decisions. Conflict in laissez-faire families is rare. When the children in laissez-faire families do not receive much interaction from their parents, they come to regard the family communication as having little value and begin to question their decision-making abilities. There's also the importance of family rituals that are created and family narratives. Family narratives are the ways that we tell stories together, and family stories are the actual content within family narratives. So when we think about the family systems perspective, we are looking at and considering open systems, closed systems, subsystems, homeostasis systems, interdependence, holism, and suprasystems. Those are important concepts in the family systems. They're also important areas to understand that there are boundaries, that boundaries are limits to the system and demarcations of where the system starts and stops. Families have internal as well as external boundaries within operating. An internal boundary regulates the way family members interact within the family unit. Internal boundaries create family subsystems that include or exclude some family members. When we think about external boundaries create a boundary around those who are and those who are not considered a part of the family system. External boundaries define the family and as well as the familiar environment. Keep those notions in your foresight and your brain. When we talk about family subsystems, we understand that families are divided into a number of subsystems. We have parent-parent relation, parent-child relationships, child-child relationships. We have parent-parent and extended family built into that. If you have a family that's living in the house with grandma or grandpa or the grandparents are also participating in the rearing and the development of that child or those children. We also have family suprasystems, which is an interesting an interesting dynamic, because when a family